Hi everyone, my name is Isabel Ortega and today I'll be presenting my research project titled The Effects of Self-Esteem Threat and Cognitive Load on Self-Enhancement. In this study, I explored how the way people feel about themselves can be influenced by external feedback and how mentally distracted they are while processing that feedback. With that said, let's look at my introduction. As we know from prior research that when people receive negative feedback, also called a self-esteem threat, they tend to feel worse about themselves. On top of that, when their minds are distracted, known as experiencing cognitive load, it becomes harder for them to maintain a positive self-image. Self-enhancement, which refers to the tendency to view ourselves in a favorable light, plays an important role in helping us cope with stress and maintain emotional well-being. This study looked at how these two factors, feedback and distraction, might work together to influence self-esteem. Next, introduction and research hypothesis. I had three main hypotheses going into this project. First, I predicted that participants who received neutral feedback would report higher self-enhancement than those who received critical feedback. In other words, this is main effect 1. Second, I predicted that participants in low cognitive condition would report high self-enhancement than those in high cognitive load condition. This is main effect 2. Lastly, I expected there would be an interaction effect, meaning that critical feedback would lower self-enhancement more strongly when combined with high cognitive load. Next, method and participants. I had recruited 10 participants, which included people and students from DePaul, as well as family members and friends. All participants were at least 18 years old and volunteered to complete the study. Next, method, materials, and measures. The study had two independent variables. The first was feedback type. Participants received either neutral or critical feedback about a task. The second was cognitive load. Participants either completed a memory task while doing the quiz or they didn't have to memorize anything. The main dependent variable was self-enhancement, measured using a 10-item questionnaire where participants rated how much they agreed with positive statements about themselves. In addition to that, I included a word recall task to check whether the cognitive load manipulation was effective. Participants were asked to recall words from a list after the task. Still in the method section, but procedure, here's what participants did. First, they read a scenario and received either neutral or critical feedback. Next, they completed a cognitive load task. Some participants had to memorize words while completing the quiz and some did not. After that, they filled out the enhancement questionnaire rating themselves on various positive traits. And lastly, they completed the word recall task, trying to remember as many words as they can from earlier. As you can see, these are the results from the word recall with and without memorization. Here is the 10-question self-enhancement questionnaire survey. As you can see on the top left corner, it's rated from a 1 through 5 scale. So depending on the person, they could either 1, rate themselves from a strongly disagree to 5, being strongly agree. And then here are just the words that were asked to be recalled with the memorization task. And then lastly, here is the results for the critical versus neutral feedback. Now, as for the results and its main effects, for main effect 1, participants who received neutral feedback reported higher self-enhancement scores. There was an average of 4.50 compared to those who received critical feedback, whose average was 3.95. This difference was statistically significant, as you can see with the ANOVA. So this hypothesis was supported. As for main effect 2, participants in the low cognitive load condition reported higher self-enhancement with an average of 4.47 than those in the high load condition who averaged 3.98. this was also significant, so this hypothesis was also supported. As for the results and the interaction effect, the results were not statistically significant. While the pattern did go in the predicted direction, with the lowest self-enhancements seen in the critical feedback high-load group, the effect was not strong enough to reach significance, so this hypothesis was not supported. Another thing was I also checked whether my participants worked as intended. For the feedback manipulation, participants in the neutral feedback condition reported more positive emotional responses, an average of 3.17 compared to 1.83 in the critical feedback condition. Additionally, a one-way ANOVA showed that recall rates varied across different words, meaning that some words were easier to remember than others. Next, discussion and the summary of the results. To sum up, both of my Main-Effects predictions were supported. Neutral feedback led to higher self-enhancement than critical feedback, and low cognitive load led to higher self-enhancement than high load. However, the interaction effect, the idea that critical feedback would have stronger impact when combined with high load, was not statistically significant. Now, study limitations. This study had a few limitations. First, the cognitive load task was fairly simple and might not reflect more complex real-world distractions. Second, the self-enhancement questionnaire used very similar wording across items, which could have influenced how participants responded. Lastly, I didn't include a baseline mood measure, so I couldn't control for how participants were feeling before the experiment began. As for further research, it would be helpful to use more realistic cognitive load tasks like multitasking with technology or managing real-life distractions. It would also be helpful to diversify the self-enhancement items to reduce wording bias and measure mood before and after the manipulations to better understand their emotional impact. And finally, future studies could explore how individual differences such as baseline self-esteem or emotional regulation skills might influence these effects. And with that said, here are my references for all the research. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any comments or questions you have. Thank you so much again.